During the last session, we have started reviewing this book, The Beautiful Tree of Sri Dharampal. And we'll continue to do so today, going to the second part. In fact, the book doesn't have two parts. Book has a single part, but then for the sake of presentation, we have split it into two. In the first part, we have examined the state of Indian education, the primary and secondary education in India before the advent of the British, that is, considering the year of 1750 as the dividing line between pre-British and post-British era. What was existing in India in 1750, that was examined, and we have seen that India had a very excellent schooling system, with almost every village having a school. It is said that India was a country of villages, something counting something like 7 lakh plus villages. But every village had a school, and the quality of education in those schools were compared with that of England at that time, and it has come out on the top on every count. The parameters for evaluation of education are listed here. The density of schools per population, ratio of students versus population, duration a child spends in the school, number of subjects child studies in the school, quality of teachers, diligence of students, financial support for the schools, caste-wise breakup of students, gender-wise breakup of students, and the number of schools in total. In every count, India came up as better than what was prevalent in Europe at that time. And in fact, compared to England, England had its schooling system growing up only around 1800, and it reached a substantial number only by 1850. But it is during this period that the Indian education system started developing problems, and then finally a decay and decline has happened, and the literacy rate went down in India, and by 1930 the literacy rate was about 4% in India. 4% of population are literate. Now in this part we shall examine the causes of this decay and what should be our priorities, and why do we make a systematic study of this, why do we need to study this, etc. The impact of the alien Raj, what was their attitude when they came in, and how it developed subsequently, and what they did to the Indian education system. This is 1783. Professor Mackenzie advocated in 83 and 88 the taking of such measures by our monarch, the sovereign of the banks of the Ganga, as may be necessary for discovering, collecting, and translating whatever is extant of the ancient works of the Hindus. He is advocating collection of the manuscripts, understanding them, and carrying this knowledge to Europe, carrying this knowledge to Britain. This was 1783. So initially, the first 50 years, the attitude of the British administrators and rulers in general was that India has a lot of knowledge base which we need to take advantage. So he says that discovering, collecting, and translating whatever is extant of the ancient works of the Hindus. He thought that if British procured these works to Europe, astronomy and antiquities and the sciences connected with them would be advanced in a still great proportion. He further observed that the antiquities of the religion and government of the Hindus are not less interesting than those of their sciences, and felt that the history, the poems, the traditions, the very fables of the Hindus might therefore throw light upon the history of the ancient world, and in particular upon the institutions of that celebrated people from whom Moses received his learning and Greece her religion and her arts. Professor Mackenzie also stated that the center of most of this learning was Benares, where all the sciences are still taught and where very ancient works in astronomy are still extant. This was 1783, and in 1784, the Asiatic Society was established by Sir William Jones. Sir William Jones was the Chief Justice of Calcutta High Court. When they say Calcutta High Court, it was the High Court of the company. He was a linguist and he was deeply interested in Sanskrit and Indian traditions, Indian philosophy, Indian history. And he started this Asiatic Society in 1784. This was the attitude of the British in the beginning. This is again 1820s. This is Sir Thomas Munro. Sir Thomas Munro was the governor of Madras Presidency. They had 3 presidencies, one in Madras, one in Calcutta, and another is in Bombay. Munro was the governor of Madras between 1820 to 27. So it is his evidence to the House of Commons committee where he stated, if a good system of agriculture, please note the superlatives that he employs. If a good system of agriculture, unrivaled manufacturing skill, a capacity to produce whatever can contribute to convenience or luxury, a capacity to produce, schools established in every village for teaching, reading, writing, and arithmetic, the general practice of hospitality and charity among each other, and above all, a treatment of the female sex full of confidence, respect, and delicacy. If all these are among the signs which denote a civilized people, then the Hindus are not inferior to the nations of Europe. And if civilization is to become an article of trade between England and India, I am convinced that England will gain by this import cargo. This is at a time when England was gaining by the import-export relation between India and England in terms of monetary benefit, in terms of trade and commerce. It is heavily loaded in favor of the British. But here, Munro, sitting at a top position, saying that in terms of culture, in terms of capacity, in terms of agriculture as well as industry, their competence is something which we would benefit greatly. When American historian Will Durant visited India in 1930, a century later after Munro, 1930, Will Durant is a very renowned historian, is a philosopher and also a historian who wrote the story of civilization in 11 volumes. So the first of his books on civilization was Our Oriental Heritage, that is towards about the East, especially India. So he came to India in 1930 to collect material for his magnum opus, the Story of Civilization. India was in a most lamentable state, about which he wrote a book called The Case for India, a small book about 150 pages, in which he made these statements. When the British came, there was throughout India a system of communal schools managed by the village communities. The agents of the East India Company destroyed these village communities, not only schools, the communities themselves. There are now in India 7,30,000 villages and only 1,62,015 primary schools. Only 7% of the boys and 1.5% of the girls receive schooling, that is 4% of the whole. Already the decay was seen naturally. There are 7,30,000 villages, but 1,62,000 schools. These 1,62,000 are not the schools of Indian system of education. They are the new schools. But the literacy rate was around 4%. In 1911, a Hindu representative, Gopalakrishna Gokhale, introduced a bill for universal compulsory education in India. It was defeated by the British and government appointed members. In 1916, Vallabhbhai Patel introduced a similar bill which was defeated by the British and the government appointed members. What were the priorities of the British? Not education, it was something else. Instead of encouraging education, the government encouraged drink. When the British came, India was a sober nation. The temperance of the people, said Warren Hastings. Warren Hastings was the Governor General of East India Company in 1770s, 1780s. He was there for 11 years. Finally, he was ousted. He was impeached by the British Parliament for corruption. But he said, when we came, the temperance of the people is demonstrated in the simplicity of their food and their total abstinence from spirituous liquors and other substances of intoxication. East India Company made handsome profit. This is Will Durant saying. East India Company made handsome profits from the trade of drinks, that is rum. When the Crown took over India, the license system was so arranged as to stimulate drinking and sales. Crown took over India in 1858 after the First War of Independence. The rule was transferred, the authority was transferred from the company's hands to the government, to the British Queen. The government revenue from such licenses has increased 7-fold in the last 40 years. In 1922, it stood at $60 million annually, 3 times the appropriation for schools and universities. 3 times more than the outlay for this education. Let us look at the causes of decay. So the Indian education system declined and lay in a shambles by the time 1850. The causes of that. From the above, it may be inferred that the decay, which is mentioned in 1822 to 25, proceeded to grow in strength during the next 6 decades. During this period, most of the indigenous institutions more or less disappeared. Any surviving remnants were absorbed by the late 19th century British system. Further, it is only after 1890 that the new system begins to equal the 1822-25 officially calculated proportions of males in schools quantitatively. Its quality in comparison to the indigenous system is another matter altogether. It took about 60-70 years to equal in numbers, but not in quality, says Dharampalji. The conditions and arrangements which alone could have made such a vast system of education feasible, the sophisticated operative fiscal arrangements of the pre-British Indian polity, substantial proportions of revenue had long been assigned for the performance of a multiplicity of public purposes. The system was that the village would retain substantial amount of the taxes and use it for self-governance. And education was the responsibility of the village panchayat. These seem to have stayed more or less intact through all the previous political turmoil during the invasion of the Pathans and the Mughals. Those political turmoil did not destroy the village self-governance fabric. They remained more or less intact, though there was turbulence and effect, and made such education possible. The system remained through that period. The collapse of this arrangement through a total centralization of revenue, as well as politics led to decay in the economy, social life, education, etc. Centralization, all the tax collected went to the center. So the village system, self-governance, that collapsed. This inference, if at all valid, warrants a re-examination of the various currently held intellectual and political assumptions with regard to the nature of pre-British Indian society and its political and state structure. When he's referring to the re-examination of the currently held intellectual and political assumptions, he is referring to what is traditionally called the Marxist approach, where they consider the Indian society as a feudal state or a primitive state, and the later British ruled condition was considered to be a better system than the earlier Indian system. Mahatma Gandhi mentioned the insupportable weight of military and civil expenditure which India could ill afford. Regarding civil expenditure, he gave an instance of what he meant. Here in England, this is Mahatma Gandhi's speech in England. Here in England, the Prime Minister gets 50 times the average income of citizens. The Viceroy in India gets 5,000 times the average income. He went on to add, from this one example, you can work out for yourselves what this civil expenditure also means to India. Both the civil expenditure, the civil servants were paid enormously higher than what a normal civil servant in England would get. The proportion was far, far higher, far different. Huge amount of money went by way of salary as well as pension, which the government insisted, the company government insisted that should be spent in England rather than in India. So the money was siphoned away. And the military expenditure also was loaded onto Indian taxes. Huge amount of those expenditure for the empire was charged to the Indian company government. So money was extracted, siphoned off into Europe, especially England. And very little, and other fiscal measures like the raw material was taken from India to England, converted into products, textile, etc., and brought back to India and resold with enormous profit. Again, money was siphoned off from India, reducing the country to penury and poverty. Brooks Adams, an American historian, even asserted that Britain's industrial revolution could not have taken off without the influx of money that followed the conquest of Bengal. Very soon after the Plassey, that is 1757, the Bengal plunder began to arrive in London, and the effect appears to have been instantaneous. For all the authorities agree that the Industrial Revolution began with the year 1760. Possibly since the world began, no investment has ever yielded the profit reaped from the Indian plunder. Please note this point, that since the world began, no investment has ever yielded the profit reaped from the Indian plunder. The economic historians are in agreement that the onset of Industrial Revolution is the most important event in the history of humanity since the domestication of animals and plants, triggered by the Indian plunder. As early as 1783, Edmund Burke, a Scottish, or I think an Irish statesman in Britain, predicted that the annual drain of Indian resources to England without equivalent return would eventually destroy India. From Plassey to Waterloo, that is 1757 to 1815, 57 years. The drain of India's wealth to England is computed by Brooks Adams at $2.5 to $5 billion. Macaulay suggested long ago that it was the stolen wealth from India which supplied England with free capital for the development of mechanical inventions and so made possible the Industrial Revolution. This is historian Will Durant, the American historian, making a case for India. And this had a tremendous influx in England, and their standard of living rose tremendously. But look at the impact on India. Sir Thomas Munro, governor of Madras, wrote that teachers do not earn more than 6 or 7 rupees monthly, which is not sufficient to induce men properly qualified to follow the profession. This problem began around 1800, notice. This is another British administrator, the collector of Bellary, A.D. Campbell, in his report in 1823. This is coming straight from the field. Look at his assessment. He says, I am sorry to state that this is ascribable to the gradual but general impoverishment of the country. The means of manufacturing classes have been of late years greatly diminished by the introduction of our own English manufactures in lieu of the Indian cotton fabrics. The transfer of the capital of the country from the native government and their officers, mark their officers also, the salary and other money which they have earned, they were asked to spend it in England, not in India. So the money transfer of the capital of the country from the native government and their officers who liberally expended it in India, officers who liberally expended it in India to Europeans restricted by law from employing it even temporarily in India. Otherwise, the officer would have said in earlier government, even under the Mughal rule, they would spend in India. Though the earlier invaders had carried off huge wealth from India, but it did not dry up the resources in India because India is a very fertile land. But the English arrangement was not that. They siphoned off the capital from the country itself. Restricted by law from employing it even temporarily in India and daily draining it from the land has likewise tended to this effect, which has not been alleviated by a less rigid enforcement of the revenue due to the state. Tax collection, there was no remission. Tax collection was hiked to almost 50% in many places across the country. The great part of the middling and lower classes of the people are now unable to defray the expenses incident upon the education of their offspring, while their necessities require the assistance of their children as soon as their tender limbs are capable of the smallest labor. Continues A.D. Campbell. Of nearly 1 million of souls in this district, Bellary district, not 7,000 are now at school. 0.7% is in school now. A proportion which exhibits but too strongly the result above stated. In many villages, where formerly there were large schools, there are now none. And in many others, where there were large schools, now only a few children of the most opulent are taught. Others being unable from poverty to attend. Continues. Such is the state of this district, of the various schools in which reading, writing, and arithmetic are taught in the vernacular dialects of the country, as has been usual in India. The higher branches of learning have been taught in Sanskrit, and it has ever in India been deemed below the dignity of science for her professors to barter it for hire. Usually the education is said to be free for the children, but it needs money to support that which used to come from the society, either through the taxes collected or voluntary contribution. But without money, a system cannot function. But it was a norm in India, a value in India, that the professors would not barter it for money. Vidyadana is considered to be given, it need to be given free. But learning, though it may proudly decline to sell its stores, has never flourished in any country except under the encouragement of the ruling power. And the countenance and support once given to science in this part of India have long been withheld. It has already been long been withheld. This is he's talking in 1823. Campbell continues. Of the 553 institutions for education, now existing in this district, I am ashamed to say not one now derives any support from the state. 553 institutions in the district, but not one derives any support from the state. There is no doubt that in former times, especially under the Hindu governments, very large grants, both in money and in land, were issued for the support of learning. Considerable alienations of revenue, which formerly did honor to the state by upholding and encouraging learning, have deteriorated under our rule into the means of supporting ignorance. It is considered an honor that so many education institutions flourish, but now we are supporting ignorance. While science, deserted by the powerful aid she formerly received from government, has often been reduced to beg her scanty and uncertain meal from the chance benevolence of charitable individuals. And it would be difficult to point out in any period in the history of India when she stood more in need. Eloquent enough? What was the policy of the government? The policy of the government was to uproot this system altogether. The limitless British hunger for revenue, so forcibly described by Campbell, starved the Indian system of the very resources which it required to survive, not necessarily flourish, but survive. Its cultural and religious content and structure provoked deliberate attempts aimed at its total extermination. It was imperative to somehow uproot the Indian indigenous system for the relatively undisturbed maintenance and continuance of British rule. It is the same imperative which decided Macaulay, Bentinck, etc. to deliberately neglect large-scale school education proposed by men like Adam till a viable system of anglicized higher education had first been established in the country. If at all it is the British system. The Indian system should be uprooted. True, as far as the known record can tell, no direct dismantling or shutting up of each and every institution was resorted to, or any other more drastic physical measures taken to achieve this demise. More drastic in the sense what the Muslim rulers did. They burned the whole universities. That kind of action the British government did not do. But such steps were unnecessary. The reason being that the fiscal steps, together with ridicule, performed the task far more effectively. James Mill. James Mill was a historian who wrote the history of British India in 1817. It was a project for him starting from 1806. He said, I'll write the British Indian history in about 7 years' time. But he took more than that. He took about 12 years to complete that. The first volume was published in 1817. After that, that book was considered to be a reference book for the administrators, British administrators coming to India, the ICS officers, etc. It was considered to be the authentic Indian history. Though James Mill never visited India, he wrote his entire book sitting in London. The complete denunciation and rejection of Indian culture and civilization was, however, left to the powerful pen of James Mill. This he did in his monumental 3-volume History of British India, first published in 1817. Thenceforth, Mill's history became an essential reading and reference book for those entrusted with administering the British Indian Empire. From the time of its publication till recently, the book History, in fact, provided the framework for the writing of most histories of India. For this reason, the impact of his judgments on India and its people should never be underestimated. According to Mill, he condemns the Indian society as a whole. Look at what he says. The same insincerity, mendacity, and perfidy, the same indifference to the feelings of others, the same prostitution and venality were the conspicuous characteristics of both the Hindus and the Muslims. The Muslims, however, were profuse when possessed of wealth and devoted to pleasure. The Hindus almost always penurious and ascetic. Penurious means they were stingy, he says, and ascetic. They would spend very little. And in truth, the Hindu, like the eunuch, excels in the qualities of a slave. Furthermore, similar to the Chinese, the Hindus surpasses even the Hindus were dissembling, treacherous, mendacious to an extent which surpasses even the usual measure of uncultivated society. Both the Chinese and the Hindus were disposed to excessive exaggeration with regard to everything relating to themselves. Both were cowardly and unfeeling. Both were in the highest degree conceited of themselves and full of affected contempt for others. And above all, both were, in a physical sense, disgustingly unclean in their persons and houses. This is the judgment of a historian who never came to India. Compared to the people of India, according to Mill, the Europeans were greatly superior, notwithstanding the defects of the feudal system in the institutions of government and in laws. Even their poetry was beyond all comparison preferable to the poetry of the Hindus. Mill felt that it was hardly necessary to assert that in the art of war, the Hindus have always been greatly inferior to the warlike nations of Europe. The agriculture of Europeans surpassed exceedingly that of the Hindus. And in India, the roads were little better than paths, and the rivers without bridges. There was not one original treatise on medicine considered as a science, and surgery was unknown among the Hindus. You may talk about Charaka, Shushruta, 1st century BC, 6th century BC, etc. But James Mill doesn't recognize any of them. Further still, Compared with the slavish and dastardly spirit of the Hindus, the Europeans were to be placed in an elevated rank with regard to manners and character and their manliness and courage. This judgment of James Mill was shared or probably borrowed by most of the European scholars during the 19th century, like Max Muller or Professor Wilson or Professor Horace. So many others were there, but all of them by and large held this viewpoint, at least in the initial part of their career. As to James Mill was a historian. There are others. Wilberforce was a statesman, a politician. Macaulay was an administrator and a very respectable British leader, writer, poet, etc. And then Karl Marx. Karl Marx was not British, but German. But then Karl Marx's opinions have ruled the intellectual milieu of the whole world, especially in the first half of 20th century. Continue. Let me continue. As to James Mill, so also to Wilberforce, Macaulay, and Karl Marx, and the thought and approaches they represented. The manners and customs and civilization of India were intrinsically barbarous. And to each of them, India could become civilized only by discarding its Indianness and by adopting utility as the object of every pursuit, according to Mill. India's value system is such the material utility is not given overwhelming importance, certainly, because the purpose of life in the Indian ethos is gaining moksha. It's a spiritual unfoldment. So that is of a top priority in India. But it is not to say that the material utility and other things are neglected. But Mill's conclusion is that it is not a virtue, but it is a negative trait. By embracing his peculiar brand of Christianity for Wilberforce was a devoted Christian and he wanted India to be converted to Christianity, and he pleaded and obtained the consent of the Parliament in 1813 for the conversion of Indian people by the missionaries. So embracing the peculiar brand of Christianity for Wilberforce, by becoming anglicized according to Macaulay, and for Marx by becoming Western. Westernization is the solution for India's ills. That's what Marx said. Prior to them, for Henry Dundas was the chairman of the board of control of East India Company around 1800. For 10, 11 years, he was the chairman. The man who governed India from London for 20 long years, Indians not only had to become subservient to British authority, but also had to feel indebted to our beneficence and wisdom for advantages they are to receive. And in like manner, feel solely indebted to our protection for the countenance and enjoyment of them before they could even qualify for being considered as civilized. This is multi-pronged hammering from various platforms. In 1813, this bold intention was publicly and powerfully expressed by William Wilberforce when he depicted Indians as being deeply sunk and by their religious superstitions fast bound in the lowest depths of moral and social wretchedness. And Thomas Macaulay expressed similar views merely using a different imagery. He commented that the totality of Indian knowledge and scholarship did not even equal the contents of a single shelf of a good European library. And that all the historical information contained in books written in Sanskrit was less valuable than what may be found in the most paltry abridgment used at preparatory schools in England. To Macaulay, all Indian knowledge, if not despicable, was at least absurd. Absurd history, absurd metaphysics, absurd physics, absurd theology. And Karl Marx seems to have had similar impressions of India. This, despite his great study of British state papers and other extensive material relating to India. Writing in the New York Daily Tribune on the 25th June 1853, he shared the view of the perennial nature of Indian misery and approvingly quoted an ancient Indian text which, according to him, placed the commencement of Indian misery in an epoch even more remote than the Christian creation of the world. This paper can be obtained from the archives, Marxist archives. This is considered to be a guideline for the Indian intellectuals, Marxist intellectuals, to interpret history, especially Indian history. Paper written in 1853, where he says that the misery of India originated long ago, even before the date which the Christian missionaries consider as the beginning of the world, which is 4004 BC. He says India talks about an earlier history, so an earlier epoch, but the misery began right then, he says. According to Marx, Indian life had always been undignified, stagnatory, vegetative, and passive, given to a brutalizing worship of nature instead of man being the sovereign of nature. Worshipping of nature is innate to Indian culture, but it does not mean that Indian culture would accept the sovereignty of nature over the self. Because the very purpose of Indian philosophy, as declared by Indian philosophy, is the conquest of nature. And given to a brutalizing worship of nature instead of man being the sovereign of nature. The sovereign of nature idea comes from the Semitic paradigm, where the entire creation is meant for the utility of the humans, which is not the conception in Indian philosophy. As contemplated in contemporary European thought, and thus Karl Marx concluded, whatever may have been the crimes of England in India, she was the unconscious tool of history in bringing about what Marx so anxiously looked forward to, that is India's westernization. He said progress means westernization in the context of India. One school of thought, that is the Marxian school of thought, uses all such foreign backing to show India's primitiveness, the barbaric, the uncouth, and what it termed as parochial nature of the customs and manners of its people, and the ignorance and oppressions and poverty which Indians are said to have always suffered from. To them, India, for most of its past, had lived at what is termed the feudal stage, or what in more recent Marxist terminology is called the system of Asiatic social organisms. Marxism divides human history into 6 stages. The third of them, I think, is the feudal state. So the Marxists are fond of calling Indian history prior to the British as the feudal state, system of Asiatic social organisms. What is the consequence of the British rule upon India? It not only demolished its education system, it demolished its economic system as well, and much more. Dharmapalji says, I quote, writing as early as 1804, William Bentinck, who later became the Governor General, 28 to 35 was the Governor General, who implemented or supported and implemented Macaulay's Minute. But in 1804, he was a young man. The young governor of Madras Presidency wrote to the president of the Board of Control. The Board of Control is the body which used to regulate the East India Company on behalf of the government of Britain. So the president of the Board of Control, Lord Castlereagh, that we have paid a great deal of attention to the revenue management in this country. The general tenor of my opinion is that we have rode the country too hard, and the consequence is that it is in a state of the most lamentable poverty. Great oppression is, I fear, exercised too generally in the collection of the revenues. This is 1804. In 1857 to 58, a military officer wrote to Governor General Canning, this is after the uprising, the first war of independence. Governor General Canning, it may be truly said that the revenue of India has hitherto been levied at the point of the bayonet, and considered this to be the major cause of the mutiny. It naturally affected the literacy level. And its replacement by an alien, rootless system whose products were so graphically described later by Ananda Kumaraswamy that the new education system had several consequences for India. To begin with, it led to an obliteration of literacy and knowledge of such dimensions amongst the Indian people that recent attempts at universal literacy and education have so far been unable to make an appreciable dent in it. It destroyed the Indian social balance, in which traditionally persons from all sections of society appear to have been able to receive fairly competent schooling. The pathshalas and madrasas had enabled them to participate openly and appropriately and with dignity, not only in the social and cultural life of their locality, but if they wished, ensured participation at the more extended levels. It is this destruction, along with similar damage in the economic sphere, which led to great deterioration in the status and socio-economic conditions and personal dignity of those who are now known as the scheduled castes, and to only a slightly lesser extent to that of the vast peasant majority encompassed by the term backward castes. The recent movements embracing these sections to a great extent seem to be aimed at restoring this basic Indian social balance. And the impact of education described by Ananda Kumaraswamy. A graphic image of the more privileged products of this British initiated education was given by Ananda Kumaraswamy as early as 1908. Ananda Kumaraswamy was a great scholar in geography, arts, literature, and many other things. Very acclaimed scholar. In 1908, he writes, "Speak to the ordinary graduate of an Indian university or a student from Ceylon of the ideals of Mahabharata, he will hasten to display his knowledge of Shakespeare. Talk to him of religious philosophy, you find that he is an atheist of the crude type common in Europe a generation ago. And that not only has he no religion, but he is as lacking in philosophy as the average Englishman. Talk to him of Indian music, he will produce a gramophone or a harmonium and inflict upon you one or both. Talk to him of Indian dress or jewelry, he will tell you that they are uncivilized and barbaric. Talk to him of Indian art, it is news to him that such a thing exists. Ask him to translate for you a letter written in his own mother tongue, he does not know it. He is indeed a stranger in his own land. Completely alienated. We are all products of this education system. Therefore, what should be our priorities now? Quoting Dharampal again. And most importantly, till today, it has kept most educated Indians ignorant of the society they live in, the culture which sustains this society and their fellow beings, this society and their fellow beings. And more tragically, yet, for over a century, it has induced a lack of confidence and loss of bearing among the people of India in general. Loss of bearing, I think it is dignity. What India possessed in the sphere of education 2 centuries ago and the factors which led to its decay and replacement are indeed a part of history. Even if the former could be brought back to life in the context of today or in the immediate future, many aspects of it would no longer be apposite. Yet, what exists today has little relevance either. An understanding of what existed and of the processes which created the irrelevance, India is burdened with today. Irrelevance of what India is burdened with today. In time could help generate what best suits India's requirements and the ethos of our people. That is it. I conclude here. And if there are any questions, comments, I would like to hear. Harinath.
Yes, sir. Namaste, sir. Thank you. So, thank you, sir, for this lecture. So, now the session is open for question and answers.
Yeah.
Saurabh, do you have a question? Anyone having a comment or question, please come forward.
No questions.
Okay, sir. Looks like no questions today.
Yeah.
Then let's end the session with Shanti Mantra.
Yeah.
Yes, sir. Om Sarve Bhavantu Sukhinah, Sarve Santu Niramaya, Sarve Bhadrani Paschyantu, Ma Kaschid Dukkha Bhag Bhavet. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Thank you, sir. Thanks everyone for joining today's session.
Thank you.